Every story of a record-breaking hurricane begins quietly, and Hurricane Patricia was no different. Its birth traces back to mid-October of the year 2015, when a sprawling cluster of thunderstorms began drifting westward off the coast of Central America into the eastern Pacific Ocean. At first, there was little reason for concern. Such systems appear frequently during the season, and many never become organized storms. For several days, Patricia remained a loose collection of clouds and showers with little structure. It faced dry air intrusions that kept it from consolidating, and forecasters initially treated it as nothing more than a disturbance to monitor. However, on October 20th, the system strengthened just enough to be classified as a tropical depression. By October 21st, the storm organized further and achieved tropical storm status. The name Patricia was assigned, making it the 24th named storm of what was already one of the busiest Pacific hurricane seasons on record. At this stage, Patricia seemed entirely ordinary. Its winds were modest, its circulation only beginning to tighten, and no major weather models predicted anything unusual. Yet beneath the surface of the Pacific, the perfect fuel for disaster was waiting. The year 2015 coincided with one of the strongest El Niño events in modern history. This climate phenomenon had been steadily warming vast areas of the Pacific Ocean for months, creating a deep pool of unusually hot water. In the region where Patricia developed, sea surface temperatures reached around 87 degrees Fahrenheit, or 31 degrees Celsius, some of the warmest ever recorded there. This extreme ocean heat provided an almost limitless energy source for any storm able to tap into it. The surrounding atmosphere also fell into alignment. Wind shear, the disruptive force that often tears apart tropical systems, was remarkably low. The air mass was saturated with moisture, removing yet another obstacle. In short, the stage was set for a storm to thrive. Conditions so ideal that meteorologists later described them as near perfect for rapid growth. At the time, however, Patricia was still seen as unremarkable. Its circulation was fragile, its thunderstorms only loosely connected, and a few expected what was to come. But quietly on the warm waters of the eastern Pacific, the seeds of the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere had been planted. What happened next with Hurricane Patricia stunned even the most seasoned forecasters. Beginning on October 22nd of the year 2015, the system started to gather strength at a pace rarely seen in meteorology. At dawn, Patricia's winds were measured at about 60 miles per hour, still only the strength of a modest tropical storm. By nightfall, it had already intensified into a hurricane with winds over 90 miles per hour. The following day, October 23rd, Patricia began one of the most extreme cases of rapid intensification ever observed. In less than 24 hours, its maximum sustained winds soared from 100 miles per hour to 200 miles per hour, while its central pressure plummeted to an astonishing 879 millibars. This made Patricia not just strong, but the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere in terms of wind speed and pressure. The speed of its intensification caught many by surprise. Typically, storms strengthen gradually, allowing meteorologists and emergency planners time to issue warnings and prepare. Patricia, however, transformed from a minimal hurricane to a Category 5 monster in a single day. The National Hurricane Center in Miami described its development as staggering and issued urgent alerts to Mexico's Pacific coast. Satellite images from the period revealed a storm that looked almost otherworldly. Patricia's eye became perfectly defined, a sharp circle surrounded by towering clouds that reached heights of over 50,000 feet. The storm's symmetry was near flawless, the classic buzzsaw ultra appearance that meteorologists associate with the most intense tropical cyclones on Earth. Part of what fueled this explosive growth was the extremely warm sea surface temperatures linked to the powerful El Niño of 2015. The ocean provided Patricia with more energy than most storms ever encounter, while low wind shear meant nothing disrupted its vertical structure. Every factor aligned for the hurricane to strengthen at the maximum possible rate. By the evening of October 23rd, the storm had already become legendary. Forecasters scrambled to revise predictions, Mexican officials rushed to issue evacuation orders, and residents of coastal towns were suddenly facing the approach of a storm unlike anything they had ever seen. Patricia had transformed from a forgettable, tropical storm into the most intense hurricane in modern Western Hemisphere history in barely more than a day. On the afternoon of October 23rd, the Pacific coast of Mexico braced for impact. Hurricane Patricia, now classified as a Category 5 storm, approached the shoreline with maximum sustained winds near 200 miles per hour. This placed it among the strongest tropical cyclones ever recorded anywhere in the world. Its projected path carried it directly toward the states of Jalisco, Colima, and Nayarit, all home to coastal communities and major tourist areas. Patricia made landfall near Cuicmala in the state of Jalisco late in the day on October 23rd. By that point, the hurricane's core remained incredibly intense, although interaction with the mountainous terrain quickly began to weaken it. Even so, the coastal areas first struck by the eye wall endured winds strong enough to uproot trees, destroy poorly built structures, and rip apart power lines in an instant. Torrential rainfall accompanied the winds, overwhelming rivers and triggering flash floods in valleys and low-lying towns. Unlike some hurricanes that linger over the sea before striking land, Patricia moved inland very quickly. This speed spared Mexico from catastrophic, widespread devastation, but the regions directly under its path still suffered heavily. Entire sections of the coastal highway were washed away, and agricultural zones saw crops flattened within hours. Coffee, banana, and corn fields that sustained that local economies were ruined, leaving many families without a livelihood. The resort city of Puerto Vallarta narrowly escaped the storm's full force as the core passed to its south. Still, strong winds caused significant damage to hotels, shops, and the city's popular boardwalk. Nearby villages were less fortunate. In smaller communities, particularly in Colima, homes built of wood or sheet metal were shredded, forcing residents to take shelter in more secure buildings such as schools and churches. Despite Patricia's record-breaking strength at sea, the death toll was surprisingly limited. Early warnings, mass evacuations, and rapid emergency responses played a vital role. Thousands of people were moved away from the most vulnerable coastal areas before landfall. Mexican authorities reported only a handful of direct fatalities, an outcome that shocked many given the storm's raw power. By the night of October 23rd, Patricia had begun weakening rapidly as it moved into Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains. Within a day, it had lost much of its ferocity, downgraded from a hurricane to a tropical depression. But while the storm itself faded, the destruction it left behind marked a defining moment in Mexico's modern history of natural disasters. In the days following Hurricane Patricia's landfall, the scale of the storm's impact became clear across western Mexico. Though the hurricane weakened rapidly after crossing the coast, its short but furious strike left behind entire communities struggling to recover. Roads connecting towns in Jalisco and Colima were blocked by landslides, making it difficult for emergency workers to deliver food, medicine, and supplies. Bridges were washed out by swollen rivers, isolating rural villages that depended on outside aid. Electricity outages spread across multiple states, with some areas left without power for several days. In Colima, water systems were disrupted, forcing residents to rely on temporary distribution by relief trucks. Families whose homes were destroyed or heavily damaged sought shelter in schools, gymnasiums, and public buildings. The Mexican government, alongside the military, set up field kitchens and distributed thousands of hot meals each day to displaced residents. The agricultural toll was particularly severe. Banana and papaya plantations were devastated, with entire harvests wiped out in a matter of hours. Livestock losses added further hardship for farming families. For many rural workers, Patricia was not just a natural disaster, but a blow to long-term survival, as fields would take months, if not years, to fully recover. Despite the destruction, international relief organizations praised Mexico's preparedness and response. The coordinated evacuation of tens of thousands of people prevented the hurricane from becoming a far deadlier event. Experts noted that if Patricia had struck a more densely populated urban center at its peak strength, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Instead, damage was concentrated, but lives were largely spared, making the hurricane an unusual case of immense power paired with relatively low mortality. Across affected states, volunteers joined recovery efforts, clearing debris and helping rebuild basic infrastructure. Medical brigades offered care in remote villages where access to hospitals had been cut off. The Mexican Red Cross, alongside civil defense groups, distributed blankets, bottled water, and hygiene supplies. The storm survivors spoke of shock at the force of the winds and gratitude that so many had been able to escape with their lives. By the end of October, Patricia had left behind a landscape marked by fallen trees, ruined crops, and scarred coastlines. While global headlines highlighted the record-breaking winds and rapid intensification for the people of western Mexico, the storm's legacy was measured in uprooted livelihoods and the slow process of rebuilding. The resilience of local communities became a central theme of the recovery, showing how preparation and cooperation lessened the human cost of one of the most powerful hurricanes in recorded history. Hurricane Patricia's story did not end when its winds calmed and the floodwaters receded. In the months and years that followed, scientists, governments, and communities reflected on what lessons could be learned from one of the most intense storms ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. Meteorologists studied Patricia's unprecedented rapid intensification, where it strengthened from a tropical storm to a record-breaking hurricane in just over 24 hours. This event underscored how climate and ocean conditions in the Pacific can align to create storms that grow with extraordinary speed, leaving very little time for communities to prepare. Globally, Patricia fueled ongoing discussions about the link between climate change and extreme weather. While scientists stressed that no single storm could be blamed entirely on warming oceans, Patricia was viewed as a warning sign of how rising sea surface temperatures may create more frequent and more powerful hurricanes in the future. For disaster planners, it reinforced the importance of evacuation strategies, early warning systems, and public communication. Mexico's effective evacuations were highlighted as a model for other nations at risk of sudden, high-intensity storms. In the realm of emergency response, Patricia shifted how agencies approached forecasting and preparedness. The World Meteorological Organization and other international groups cited Patricia as a case study for how global cooperation in monitoring and predicting tropical systems can save lives. In classrooms and training programs, Patricia became a reference point for emergency managers, learning how to react swiftly to fast-developing threats. For residents of Western Mexico, the storm's legacy was more personal. Entire communities carried forward stories of survival, resilience, and rebuilding. Farmers worked to restore crops that had been lost, while towns along the coast rebuilt schools, homes, and businesses damaged by the storm. The experience created a stronger awareness of disaster preparedness at the local level, with many communities improving shelters and practicing evacuation drills in the years after the hurricane. Even a decade later, Patricia remains a benchmark in the study of hurricanes. Its combination of record-setting wind speeds, rapid development, and relatively limited loss of life set it apart from many other historic storms. The hurricane demonstrated both the destructive potential of nature and the power of human readiness to prevent mass tragedy. In the end, Hurricane Patricia is remembered not just for its incredible strength, but also for the lessons it left behind. It showed the world that while extreme weather cannot be stopped, preparation, science, and collective action can determine whether a storm becomes a catastrophe or a story of resilience. The story of Hurricane Iniki begins quietly, far from the lush shores of Kauai. On Sunday, September 5th of 1992, a small cluster of thunderstorms churned over the eastern Pacific Ocean. At first, it was little more than a tropical disturbance, common in those waters, rarely a serious threat to the Hawaiian Islands. Its roots may have stretched thousands of miles across the globe, seeded by an atmospheric wave that had traveled from the African coast weeks before. Slowly, the disturbance organized, and by September 5th, it was classified as a tropical depression. For Hawaiians, this posed no alarm. Hurricanes were something the islands had learned to dismiss. In living memory, most systems had bent away to the north or slipped harmlessly south, deflected by a protective ridge of high pressure known as the subtropical ridge. This invisible shield had spared the islands again and again, leaving residents to believe that direct strikes were unlikely, almost mythical. As the first week of September unfolded, life on Kauai was completely normal. Families were preparing for the start of the high school football season. Skies were brilliantly clear, and the island's gardens and forests flourished under the late summer sun. There was no sense of urgency, no reason to suspect the peace would soon end. By Tuesday, September 8th, the depression had intensified into a tropical storm, earning its name Iniki, a Hawaiian word meaning strong and piercing wind. A day later, it strengthened further, upgraded to a hurricane. Forecasts continued to show the system tracking westward, expected to pass south of the Hawaiian chain without incident. The greatest concern voiced at the time was the potential for a high surf along south-facing shores. But while people went about their daily lives, the atmosphere above them was changing. The subtropical ridge, the very shield that had protected Hawaii for decades began to weaken. At the same time, a deep trough of low pressure started digging southward across the central Pacific, acting like a giant vacuum in the atmosphere. This subtle but critical shift would set Iniki on a path unlike any storm before it. By Thursday, September 10th, forecasters at the Central Pacific Hurricane Center were grappling with uncertainty. Some computer models still suggested the hurricane would remain on its westward course. Others, however, showed an alarming alternative, a sudden and sharp turn to the north. For now, those projections were treated as outliers, but in just a matter of hours, they would prove to be tragically correct. On the morning of Friday, September 11th of 1992, residents of Kauai woke to radio bulletins that left many stunned. Overnight, Hurricane Iniki had executed the feared northward turn. What had once seemed like a distant storm was now racing directly toward the island. By sunrise, Iniki had reached Category 4 strength, with sustained winds near 140 miles per hour. At 8 o'clock that morning, the Central Pacific Hurricane Center issued a hurricane warning for Kauai. This was the first time in modern Hawaiian history that such an urgent alert had been delivered for the island. Schools closed immediately, businesses shuttered their doors, and families scrambled to buy last-minute supplies. Stores quickly ran out of bottled water, canned goods, and flashlights. For many, it was their first true hurricane preparation experience. By midday, the outer bands of Iniki began sweeping across Kauai. Heavy rain fell in bursts, bending palm trees and obscuring the mountains in sheets of gray. Around 1 in the afternoon, the sky darkened as though it were twilight, even though the sun was high above the Pacific. The storm's eye was rapidly approaching. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the full force of Iniki made landfall on Kauai's south shore near the town of Waimea. Wind gusts were recorded at more than 160 miles per hour, strong enough to rip roofs from homes and snap utility poles like matchsticks. Debris flew through the air as if it were shrapnel. Entire groves of trees were flattened in minutes. The storm surge arrived shortly after, inundating coastal neighborhoods. Walls of seawater up to 6 feet high pushed inland, destroying boats, flooding houses, and sweeping vehicles from roads. Some residents who had ignored evacuation orders found themselves trapped, clinging to trees, or climbing onto rooftops as the waters rose. For more than 2 hours, Kauai was battered relentlessly. As the eye passed over, a brief and eerie calm settled across parts of the island. The winds died, and for a moment, people stepped outside to survey the devastation. But this peace lasted only half an hour before the back half of the storm slammed the island with equal, if not greater, ferocity. By evening, Iniki had passed northward, leaving behind silence, broken only by the sound of dripping rain and distant sirens. Kauai, once lush and vibrant, was now a scene of staggering destruction. What had been a paradise that morning was unrecognizable by nightfall. When daylight returned on Saturday, September 12th of 1992, the full scope of Iniki's devastation became clear. Nearly every structure on Kauai had suffered some form of damage, with entire neighborhoods reduced to piles of splintered wood and twisted metal. Officials later estimated that more than 14,000 homes were damaged, and over 1,400 were completely destroyed. Roofs were peeled away with ease, leaving families exposed to the elements. Electric power was cut off island-wide, plunging residents into darkness for weeks. Fallen transmission lines crisscrossed roads while utility poles leaned or snapped across highways, blocking travel. Communication was crippled as well. Telephone service collapsed, and emergency radios became the only reliable link between communities. The lack of information left many people uncertain about when aid might arrive. Agriculture, the lifeblood of Kauai, was devastated. The island's famous sugar-cane fields were flattened, and fruit orchards were stripped bare in a matter of hours. Entire crops were lost, dealing a severe blow to farmers and the local economy. Iniki also uprooted countless trees, leaving barren hillsides where lush green once thrived. Tourism, another critical industry, ground to a halt. Hotels along the southern coast were left in ruins, with shattered windows, flooded lobbies, and debris littering once pristine beaches. Visitors stranded on the island faced limited food, water, and shelter, relying heavily on the generosity of residents. The image of paradise had been replaced by scenes of ruin. The natural environment also bore deep scars. Coral reefs were smashed by the storm surge, and countless birds lost their nesting grounds. Some endangered species already struggling for survival, faced even greater challenges after the hurricane reshaped their habitats. Altogether, damages from Hurricane Iniki were calculated at around $3 billion, making it the costliest hurricane in Hawaiian history. Yet beyond the numbers, what stood out most was the sheer scale of human loss, homes, livelihoods, and the sense of safety that had once defined life on Kauai. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Iniki, the United States military played a crucial role in relief operations. Within hours, cargo planes began arriving from Oahu, bringing food, water, medical supplies, and emergency crews. The National Guard was deployed to restore order, clear roads, and distribute essentials to families who had lost nearly everything. For many residents, the sight of helicopters dropping aid packages was the first sign of hope since the storm passed. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, established command centers on Kauai to coordinate disaster response. Thousands of residents registered for assistance, and emergency shelters were set up in schools, churches, and community centers. The American Red Cross mobilized volunteers nationwide, providing meals, blankets, and temporary housing to those displaced. One of the unique challenges after Iniki was restoring communication. With telephone lines destroyed and electricity unavailable, the only reliable way to reach the outside world was through amateur radio operators. These volunteer ham radio users relayed critical information between Kauai and other islands, keeping both officials and families connected during the crisis. The recovery also depended heavily on local communities pulling together. Neighbors shared food and water, while residents organized cleanup crews to clear debris from homes and roads. Schools that had lost roofs and classrooms still tried to resume lessons, often holding classes outdoors under makeshift tents. Celebrities and public figures also drew attention to the disaster. Musicians from Hawaii and across the mainland organized benefit concerts, raising funds for rebuilding efforts. The storm even disrupted Hollywood. Production for the movie Jurassic Park, which was being filmed on Kauai, was forced to shut down temporarily due to the extensive damage. Rebuilding took years. Many families lived in temporary housing long after the storm passed, and full restoration of electricity and infrastructure stretched into months. Insurance companies were overwhelmed with claims, and for some residents, recovery was a slow and frustrating process. Despite the hardships, the resilience of Kauai's people became a defining story of Hurricane Iniki. The island had been brought to its knees, but the strength of its communities and the aid from across the nation kept recovery moving forward. Hurricane Iniki left behind more than broken homes and battered landscapes. It reshaped how Hawaii prepares for natural disasters. The storm exposed weaknesses in communication systems, power grids, and evacuation planning. In the years that followed, the state invested heavily in stronger emergency sirens, improved weather monitoring, and updated building codes designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. For residents of Kauai, the memory of Iniki became a generational touchstone. Families passed down stories of survival and resilience, ensuring that the lessons of 1992 would not be forgotten. Annual hurricane preparedness drills became more common across the islands, with officials urging households to keep at least 2 weeks of supplies on hand in case of another major storm. The economic impact lingered for years. Tourism, a cornerstone of Hawaii's economy, suffered a major setback as resorts and attractions on Kauai struggled to reopen. Some businesses never returned, while others rebuilt stronger and more storm-resistant. Farmers, too, had to start over, replanting crops and repairing damaged irrigation systems. Iniki also carried a sobering reminder of climate vulnerability. While hurricanes in Hawaii are rare, scientists have noted that warming ocean waters could increase the strength of storms reaching the islands. For many, Iniki is still a warning of what future hurricanes might look like in a changing climate. 3 decades later, Hurricane Iniki remains the strongest hurricane ever recorded in Hawaii's history. It tested the island of Kauai in ways no one could have imagined, but it also showed the strength and determination of its people. Today, the legacy of Iniki is not only the destruction it caused, but also the improvements it inspired in preparedness and resilience. Hawaii continues to carry the scars of that September day, but it also carries the knowledge and readiness to face whatever storms may come next. In the Eastern Pacific, hurricanes often form quietly, far from land, and go unnoticed. But in mid-October of 2002, conditions aligned to create something different, something dangerous. A tropical wave moved westward over Central America, drifting into waters unusually warm for that time of year. By October 19th, this weather disturbance had entered the eastern North Pacific, where ocean temperatures were well above average, providing a nearly perfect energy source for storm development. Warm sea surfaces are a hurricane's fuel, and the air above was saturated with moisture. On top of that, wind shear, the shifting of wind speed or direction with altitude, was exceptionally low, allowing the storm to organize without interference. Over the next few days, the system slowly gained strength. By October 22nd, the National Hurricane Center officially classified it as a tropical depression south of Mexico. Within hours, it strengthened further, earning the name Tropical Storm Kenna, the 12th named storm of the busy 2002 Pacific hurricane season. At first, it appeared like any other moderate storm, with winds barely reaching tropical storm force. Forecasters monitored it, but the models underestimated what was coming. The storm was slowly coiling, feeding off the unusually warm water and calm atmosphere, building the internal engine that would allow it to intensify rapidly in the days ahead. Kenna's early life was a quiet prelude, a whisper before the roar. While it remained over open water, no one could have predicted just how quickly it would transform into one of the most powerful hurricanes ever observed in the eastern Pacific. Between October 23rd and 25th, Hurricane Kenna entered a period of explosive growth that would cement its place in meteorological history. Once a modest tropical storm, Kenna began feeding relentlessly on the exceptionally warm waters of the eastern Pacific. Within just over 48 hours, the storm's maximum sustained winds surged from roughly 75 miles per hour to an astonishing 165 miles per hour. This level of intensification is extremely rare and highlighted the perfect combination of oceanic heat and atmospheric conditions. Alongside the wind increase, Kenna's central pressure dropped dramatically, reaching a record low of 913 millibars at its peak. The lower the pressure in a hurricane's eye, the more intense the storm, and this reading placed Kenna among the strongest hurricanes ever recorded in the eastern Pacific at that time. Reconnaissance aircraft flew into the storm and reported extreme turbulence and tightly packed eyewall clouds, confirming the unprecedented power swirling within. During this phase, Kenna became the third Category 5 hurricane of the 2002 Pacific hurricane season, tying the seasonal record for the most storms of that intensity in a single year. Unlike the other Category 5 storms that stayed at sea, Kenna was turning toward land, making its explosive growth all the more concerning for coastal populations. Satellite images captured the perfectly symmetrical eye and dense ring of clouds surrounding it, signaling a storm that had reached near optimal intensity. Meteorologists watched in awe as Kenna's rapid strengthening defied most forecast models. The storm was no longer just another Pacific hurricane. It had become a force capable of causing catastrophic destruction should it make landfall. Emergency preparations along Mexico's western coast began in earnest, but forecasters knew that even with advanced warning, the raw power of Kenna would be nearly impossible to mitigate. As Hurricane Kenna barreled northward, the storm's trajectory became an urgent concern for meteorologists and local authorities. A high-pressure system to the north acted like a steering mechanism, directing Kenna straight toward the western coast of Mexico. Its path threatened a mix of small fishing towns, agricultural areas, and the major tourist hub of Puerto Vallarta. By late October 24th, about 27 hours before landfall, the Mexican government issued a hurricane watch along the stretch from Mazatlan to La Fortuna. That watch was rapidly upgraded to a hurricane warning as Kenna's approach accelerated. Officials mobilized evacuation efforts, focusing first on the vulnerable coastal villages. Approximately 40,000 residents and tourists were evacuated in anticipation of the storm's arrival. In San Blas, a small town with roughly 9,000 residents, almost everyone heeded the warnings and left, leaving only a few hundred behind. In Puerto Vallarta, panic mixed with logistical challenges. Hotels reinforced windows and doors, while the airport quickly became congested as travelers tried to depart before closures. Streets that were normally bustling fell silent as people sought shelter. Emergency personnel monitored the situation closely, aware that the combination of storm surge, intense winds, and torrential rainfall could make Kenna devastating, even if its eye wall missed the city directly. As Kenna drew closer, ocean swells grew dramatically and the sky took on an ominous hue. The calm before the storm was deceptive, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Local officials broadcast urgent warnings, urging people to remain indoors and follow evacuation instructions. Scientists watching satellite imagery noted the hurricane's eye had maintained perfect symmetry, a sign of its exceptional strength and the catastrophic potential of the landfall that was only hours away. On the morning of October 25, 2002, Hurricane Kenna made landfall near San Blas, Nayarit, as a Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds reaching 140 miles per hour. Although slightly weaker than its peak at sea, Kenna still carried immense destructive potential. The first threat was the storm surge. Along the coast, water levels rose dramatically, with the waves reaching 16 feet in San Blas. Entire streets were submerged and the surge rushed inland, toppling vehicles and flooding homes. The wind arrived shortly after. Roofs were torn from houses, wooden structures splintered, and debris became dangerous projectiles. Even well-built buildings sustained severe damage. Commercial fishing boats were lifted from docks and hurled onto land, while palm trees and power lines were flattened in a relentless onslaught. Rainfall compounded the devastation. Kenna dumped nearly 19 inches in some areas, triggering flash floods and mudslides that washed out roads and isolated dozens of remote villages. Emergency crews faced major challenges accessing affected areas due to washed-out bridges and debris-covered highways. In Puerto Vallarta, although the eye remained offshore, the city experienced catastrophic coastal flooding. Waves of up to 10 feet swept over the Malecón and pushed hundreds of feet inland, damaging hotels, shops, and beachfront properties. Local officials reported that much of the commercial district suffered significant structural damage, and widespread power outages left residents in darkness for days. By afternoon, Kenna had moved inland, weakening rapidly as it encountered the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains. Yet even as it degraded into a tropical storm over land, the storm left behind a trail of destruction that would take months to repair. The human cost, though mitigated by evacuations, included at least 4 confirmed deaths, along with over 100 injuries from flying debris and accidents during the storm. By October 26, 2002, the sun rose on the devastated communities along Mexico's Pacific coast. San Blas, which took the direct hit, was described as a scene of near-total destruction. Roughly 80% of homes were destroyed, with the remaining structures suffering major damage. Streets were clogged with fallen trees, shattered roofing, and scattered debris. Residents returning from emergency shelters faced the grim reality of rebuilding their lives from nothing. Puerto Vallarta, spared a direct eyewall strike, still endured significant economic loss. The storm surge had gutted the lower floors of hotels and shops along the waterfront. Over 150 stores reported damage, and several major hotels required months of repair before reopening. Transportation and communication lines were disrupted, isolating parts of the city temporarily. Agriculture also suffered severely. Banana, tobacco, and tomato crops were decimated across Nayarit, affecting more than 700 farming families who relied on these harvests for their livelihoods. Relief agencies quickly mobilized, providing food, water, and temporary shelter to those displaced. The Mexican government declared the region a disaster area, and international aid began to arrive to assist with recovery efforts. Despite the scale of destruction, the human toll remained remarkably low thanks to timely evacuations and disaster preparedness measures. Official reports confirmed 4 deaths and over 100 injuries, primarily caused by flying debris and accidents during the storm. Communities immediately began cleanup efforts, removing sand, mud, and wreckage, and slowly restoring essential services. Kenna's aftermath highlighted both the destructive power of Pacific hurricanes and the resilience of the affected populations. It served as a stark lesson in the importance of preparedness and evacuation, proving that even the most intense storms can see reduced fatalities if warnings are heeded. Hurricane Kenna's story did not end when the winds died down. Its record-breaking intensity left an indelible mark on the history of Eastern Pacific hurricanes. With peak sustained winds of 165 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 913 millibars, Kenna became one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the region. Its rapid intensification from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in just over 48 hours remains a textbook example of extreme tropical cyclone development. At the time of landfall on October 25, 2002, Kenna was the second most intense Pacific hurricane to strike Mexico's western coast, surpassed only by a storm in 1959. Its Category 4 landfall still caused widespread devastation, but the narrow path and effective evacuations limited the human toll. Hurricane Kenna's name was retired by the World Meteorological Organization, a permanent reminder of the storm's destructive potential. Meteorologists continue to study Kenna to better understand rapid intensification events. The storm highlighted the critical role of exceptionally warm ocean waters, low wind shear, and atmospheric moisture in fueling powerful hurricanes. Kenna also underscored the vulnerability of Mexico's Pacific coastline to extreme storms, informing future disaster preparedness and coastal planning. Beyond science, Kenna became a cultural touchstone for the communities it affected. Stories of resilience and survival emerged as families rebuilt their homes, businesses reopened, and agriculture slowly recovered. While the damage totaled over $100 million, the strength of local communities helped prevent what could have been even greater tragedy. Hurricane Kenna stands as a sobering case study in the force of nature, a stark reminder that even with advanced forecasting, tropical cyclones can reach unprecedented intensities with little warning. Its legacy is measured not just in records and statistics, but in the lessons learned about preparedness, rapid response, and the enduring resilience of those in its path. From its quiet birth to its explosive peak and devastating landfall, Kenna cemented itself as one of the most memorable and scientifically significant hurricanes in Pacific history. It remains a benchmark for understanding the raw power of tropical cyclones and the need for constant vigilance along vulnerable coastlines. In the early 1980s, Hawaii stood as the ultimate image of tranquility. The island sat isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. Tourists flocked to Oahu, Maui, Kauai, and the Big Island to escape the chaos of the mainland, while residents lived to the rhythm of the trade winds, the surf, and a climate that seemed to promise eternal calm. For many people, the idea of a major hurricane striking the islands simply did not fit into their worldview. This sense of invulnerability was not just cultural, it was also rooted in history. Hawaii had not experienced a direct destructive hurricane since the early 20th century. Smaller tropical storms had brushed the islands from time to time, but nothing in living memory compared to the catastrophic cyclones that battered places like the Gulf Coast or the Caribbean. Meteorologists even noted that the region's relatively cooler waters and the stabilizing influence of surrounding weather patterns tended to weaken storms before they reached Hawaii. Over time, this gave rise to a powerful myth that the islands were naturally protected, shielded by the Pacific itself. This belief shaped nearly every aspect of life. Coastal communities expanded without serious consideration of storm surge risks. Hotels and resorts, particularly on Kauai and Oahu, were designed to highlight oceanfront beauty rather than to withstand hurricane-force winds. Families rarely kept emergency supplies beyond what was needed for short-term power outages, and even the state's disaster plans were limited, built more for tsunamis than for cyclones. But beneath the calm, Hawaii's greatest vulnerability was growing: complacency. A generation had passed without a hurricane-level disaster, and with each quiet season, the collective memory of danger faded further into the past. It was a blind spot that would prove catastrophic. In November of 1982, a storm was brewing thousands of miles away that would soon shatter the illusion of safety and remind the islands, in the harshest possible way, that paradise is never immune to nature's fury. Hurricane Iwa began not near Hawaii, but thousands of miles away in the warm waters of the Central Pacific during late November of 1982. The storm first appeared as a low-pressure disturbance several hundred miles southwest of the islands. At the time, meteorologists were already dealing with unusual conditions tied to one of the strongest El Niño events of the 20th century. This weather pattern was shifting currents and altering the atmosphere across the Pacific, creating an environment that allowed tropical cyclones to strengthen more easily than normal in this part of the ocean. By November 19th, the disturbance had grown into a tropical depression. Satellite technology, still relatively new in the early 1980s, gave forecasters their first clear look at the system's organization. As the depression gathered strength, it evolved into a tropical storm and was given the name Iwa. For a time, it appeared the storm might veer away, but shifts in the jet stream began steering it toward the Hawaiian chain. Over the next 2 days, Iwa intensified. Warm ocean waters fueled its growth, while favorable winds allowed it to maintain a strong circulation. By November 23rd, the storm had reached hurricane status, with sustained winds climbing past 100 miles per hour. Although this made Iwa only a Category 1 hurricane, its large size and projected track through the islands made it especially dangerous. Warnings began to filter through the islands, but the timing worked against the public. Many residents were preoccupied with preparations for Thanksgiving, and with decades having passed since Hawaii's last major hurricane, few took the storm seriously at first. Government officials and weather experts urged people to secure property and prepare for possible flooding, but a sense of disbelief lingered across the islands. Unseen from the shorelines of Kauai and Oahu, Hurricane Iwa was steadily advancing, its spiral bands stretching wide across the ocean, carrying with them the winds and waves that would soon mark the most destructive storm Hawaii had experienced in over 60 years. On the afternoon of November 23, 1982, Hurricane Iwa swept dangerously close to the Hawaiian Islands. The storm did not make direct landfall but passed just northwest of Kauai, close enough that the island bore the brunt of its powerful winds and surging seas. By this point, Iwa's sustained winds were over 100 miles per hour, with even stronger gusts ripping through coastal and inland areas. As the outer bands reached Oahu and Kauai, power lines toppled and entire communities were plunged into darkness. Coconut trees and massive banyan trees, normally symbols of resilience, were snapped in half or uprooted completely. Homes built with lighter materials stood little chance against the pounding winds. Roofs were torn away, walls collapsed, and windows shattered as debris turned into dangerous projectiles. The storm surge was equally devastating. Along the coastlines of Kauai, seawater rushed inland, swamping neighborhoods, destroying piers, and sweeping away boats. The island of Niihau also faced heavy impacts, though fewer details emerged because of its limited population and restricted access. On Oahu, waves as high as 25 feet struck Waikiki and other shoreline communities, leaving behind wreckage that stunned both residents and tourists. Communication was another casualty of Iwa. Telephone lines went down, making it nearly impossible for families to reach loved ones or for officials to get accurate information from the hardest hit areas. Radio broadcasts became the primary source of updates, with announcers urging people to stay indoors and away from floodwaters. As evening fell, the storm continued its assault. The timing made recovery efforts nearly impossible, and people were forced to endure the hurricane's fury through the night. For many, the sound of howling winds, crashing waves, and collapsing structures was unlike anything they had ever experienced. When the winds finally began to ease, entire towns on Kauai and Oahu were left in ruins, and it was clear that Hawaii had faced one of the most destructive hurricanes in its modern history. When daylight returned on November 24, 1982, the scope of Hurricane Iwa's destruction became visible. On Kauai, nearly every community reported severe damage. Roads were blocked by fallen trees, power poles, and piles of wreckage. Utility crews struggled to even begin assessments as the damage stretched for miles across the island. The electricity grid was shattered. At least half of Kauai's residents were without power, some for weeks, and water systems were also disrupted. Schools and public buildings were closed indefinitely, many having lost roofs or suffered structural damage. Farmers on the island faced staggering losses as entire fields of taro, sugarcane, and vegetables were flattened or flooded. Oahu also revealed widespread destruction. The state's capital, Honolulu, was spared from the storm's full force, but still suffered heavy losses, especially along the coastline. Dozens of boats in Honolulu harbor were sunk or severely damaged, leaving the state's fishing and shipping industries reeling. Waikiki's beachfront hotels and businesses were covered in sand and debris, forcing closures during what was normally a busy holiday season. Air travel was brought to a halt. Honolulu International Airport reported damage to facilities, and with power outages across the islands, communications and scheduling collapsed. Relief flights were grounded at first, and stranded travelers were left uncertain about when they would be able to leave or receive aid. The economic toll was immediately clear. Initial estimates placed the destruction at over $200 million, making Iwa the most expensive hurricane in Hawaii's recorded history at that time. Insurance companies faced a flood of claims, while families without coverage were left to rely on limited savings and federal disaster assistance. Yet, amid the devastation, the community response was swift. Neighbors worked together to clear roads and share food. Churches and schools opened as makeshift shelters, housing families who had lost everything. Local radio stations became lifelines, broadcasting locations for aid, food, and medical services. As federal and state officials began arriving on the islands, it was clear that Hawaii was facing a disaster unlike any it had seen in decades. The storm had not only battered homes and businesses, it had also tested the resilience of the islands themselves. In the days following Hurricane Iwa, federal assistance quickly became essential. On November 27, 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared Kauai and Oahu federal disaster areas, unlocking millions of dollars in aid. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, which was still relatively new at the time, coordinated with Hawaii's state government to provide emergency housing, food, and rebuilding assistance. On Kauai, the hardest hit island, hundreds of families were left without homes. Temporary shelters filled with evacuees who had lost nearly everything in the storm. Mobile housing units were brought in, but it took weeks before most displaced families had stable living arrangements. Businesses also struggled to recover, as many small shops and farms lacked the resources to rebuild quickly without federal loans. Relief workers described the island as a landscape of blue tarps, as damaged roofs were hastily patched to keep out the rain. Churches, schools, and community groups became central hubs for distributing food and supplies, with volunteers working alongside National Guard units to organize relief. The economic consequences stretched far beyond the immediate destruction. Kauai's tourism industry, which depended heavily on winter visitors, was devastated by the storm's timing. Many hotels had to close for repairs, leading to widespread layoffs. Agricultural losses were equally severe, as entire harvests of sugarcane and other crops were lost, forcing some farms out of business entirely. Oahu faced its own challenges. Honolulu's busy harbor, one of the state's most vital economic lifelines, needed significant repairs after dozens of vessels were sunk or wrecked. Restoring shipping and fishing operations was critical, as the islands depended heavily on imported goods. The financial cost continued to climb, eventually surpassing $250 million. For Hawaii, which had not experienced a hurricane of this magnitude in modern history, the recovery revealed just how vulnerable the islands were to extreme weather. Despite the hardship, the resilience of Hawaii's communities stood out. Stories emerged of neighbors sharing food and supplies, of volunteers helping rebuild homes, and of people coming together to support those who had lost the most. For many residents, the recovery was not just about restoring property, it was about restoring a sense of normalcy and strength, after the islands had been tested by one of the most destructive storms in their history. Hurricane Iwa left behind more than physical damage. It reshaped how Hawaii prepared for future storms. Before 1982, many residents believed the islands were relatively safe from major hurricanes since decades had passed without a direct strike. Iwa shattered that sense of security. In the years that followed, Hawaii invested in stronger disaster preparedness systems. Emergency broadcast alerts were updated, evacuation procedures were re-examined, and building codes were strengthened to better withstand high winds and storm surge. The hurricane also prompted new research into Pacific weather patterns, particularly the influence of El Niño, which had played a role in steering Iwa toward the islands. The storm's financial toll, which reached more than $250 million, remained one of the highest disaster costs in Hawaii's history up to that time. For many, it became clear that the state's economy, heavily dependent on tourism, agriculture, and shipping, could be severely disrupted by just one powerful storm. Insurance companies adjusted policies, and government agencies began pushing for stronger infrastructure to protect the island's most critical industries. Culturally, Iwa became a shared memory for those who lived through it. Residents recalled the eerie silence before the winds, the long hours without power, and the community efforts that helped them recover. It became a reminder of Hawaii's vulnerability in the vast Pacific, where storms could appear with little warning and leave devastation in their path. Hurricane Iwa also served as a warning for future generations. When Hurricane Iniki struck Kauai a decade later in 1992, many emergency managers credited the lessons learned from Iwa for saving lives. Iwa had shown the importance of preparation, communication, and resilience in the face of nature's power. Today, the story of Hurricane Iwa is remembered not only for the destruction it caused, but also for the lessons it taught. It was a turning point that reshaped Hawaii's relationship with natural disasters, proving that even paradise is not safe from the fury of the sea and sky.